Can I hear you now?
Hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you now. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. Gonna have a little fun and gonna talk some stuff. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for this debate, and I'd like to thank everybody who may or may not listen and watch for this opportunity to talk about this. This is a very serious topic for me. Though economics by trade is what I do, labor economics is not really a big part of what I do. I stick typically to monetary and international, even to go as far as to say international monetary. But this is still a stringent point because this leads into some of the work that I do later on with wage disparity in between nations and things of that nature. So I'm going to start off real quick with 4 points on why the minimum wage should be abolished. The first point: minimum wage laws are costly, taxpayer funded, monitoring and enforcement are part of the mechanism for the government, whether it's city, state, or federal. The market set wages do not have to pay that cost. Second point is forced discrimination. Whenever you set a bar for what you have to pay someone, you are forcing an employer to discriminate between one or another. Whereas without that discrimination effect, you'd hire them both and just set wages separate to which one you wanted to pay more versus the other, which would be more fair in the long run. It denies on-the-job training. This is a serious contention for me because I've done trade work. I've worked with electricians. I've worked with carpenters. So one of the biggest gripes that I was always told by electricians is they want more on-the-job training with people, but they cannot afford to pay the minimum wage to get someone to work for them and train them as they're going through the job, because there's no way that that person's marginal product is equal to the price that they're going to get paid anyway. And the fourth is price controls are always distortionary. In in no setting do we find that a price control, whether it's a price ceiling or a price minimum, is it good for the market? The market has to distort itself to match that in an equilibrium. So those are my 4 points. If you have anything to say on them, I'm gonna let it run back to you.
Okay, so I guess this would be my first rebuttal then. Um, I think your first point when you say it's costly to the taxpayer and the state has to monitor it. Um, y- uh, well, usually I would actually kind of lean your way because I don't know if you know I really like Ron Paul and I listen to his show every day, so I hear this argument a lot. But the thing is, I don't feel like it should be increased um, per se, but I'm just not convinced that there shouldn't be one. And so to go to your 4 points, when you say that it's costly and it puts burden on the taxpayer and the state, there's a lot of there's corporate welfare and there's a lot of subsidies to corporations to create these jobs. So I don't really see how if why like if they can't afford to pay someone that much money, like why is that a job that we should have? Is it would be my contention with that, especially because these taxpayers are supporting corporate welfare. Um, as far as as the discrimination argument goes, um, I'm not I'm looking at minimum wage just as having one is that it is a choice because it's just a standard that a society is setting that if you can't afford to pay me this much then this job isn't worth having. So I mean, is it really a job that anyone would want? I guess would be my question for you on your second point. As far as the on the job training goes, I mean, I hear that being an electrician, for example, is actually a really great field to get into because it's growing, and I've had a lot of the friends that I've had who worked in that field made really good money. Even if this electrician, if they can't afford to pay this trainee, this trainee they could probably go through some sort of education program and easily make that back in that field. So I'm not really sure if the employer uh, if they really need it. I mean, it's important for an employer to train their employees, but if that's if the how does it how what is the training? I guess there's other ways for them to be trained. Um, and as far as the distortion of price control, um, I know like we talked about this before, and I think this is one issue where both sides have really great arguments, and they both can point to statistics, um, but I haven't really seen any evidence, and as far as I know, there really isn't any evidence that having a minimum wage, not increasing it, but I'm not arguing for an increase because I don't want to confuse anyone. But there's no evidence that creating a minimum wage or that any increase that history has eliminated any job. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to you.
Okay, so first things first, corporate welfare. I get what you're trying to say, but it's not really relevant to the debate issue. Corporate welfare is a problem, but I mean, just because the government dumps stuff for corporate welfare does not equate the idea that we can somehow manage to pay for the issues with the monitoring and enforcement of these minimum wage laws, because they are costly. I mean, you have to pay for the bureaucrat, you have to pay for the actual person who goes from place to place, and then you have to pay for the person who's doing all the analyzing of the data, and then you have to go through payroll, which goes through ADP most likely because it's the biggest payroll organization, and then you have to add on to them on what they're doing, which is costly, because it's going to raise their prices for what they have to do as well. So yeah, now when you say the societal standard, society doesn't have any standards. They don't. That's like saying this chair has standards, this table has standards. They don't have standards. Society doesn't have standards. Individuals have standards. That's where the standard mark is. Now, those standards are completely subjective, but we're talking about an objective fact, whether or not we should raise or whether or not we should abolish the minimum wage. And objectively, we can say that a minimum wage, based on the other arguments, causes harm. And you can take it from a consequentialist standpoint and say that this harm is greater than the benefits received, therefore we should remove it. Or you can take a Kantian view and say, in fact, distorting the market is inherently wrong and immoral because they're using force to make someone do something that they don't necessarily want to do. Now, the denies on the job training, right? You said, well, these people can get the education of the places. Sure, they can. One, it's not nearly as good. You can go to a trade school and you can get a trade done, and you're going to have many problems getting a job. It's a simple fact. I have friends that have come out of community colleges which do trades, and I've had friends go to actual trade schools to do this, and they are on the market, always lose to folks who have on-the-job training. And now these on-the-job trainings are done by these large companies that can afford to do it, and they can set the wages at the minimum wage and work the person up. But the secondary point of that is that any education program, 90% of the time, is going to be government funded. Now, again, this puts a higher burden on the taxpayers and goes back to the first set where the monitoring and enforcement mechanism costs money, plus training people costs money, whereas they could get the on-the-job training, and it would be a direct cost to the consumer and a direct cost to the owner of the business and to the teacher. That's why there's not a lot of on-the-job training. Now, you go to more unionized places in America, you might see more on-the-job training. That's because unions have a bigger budget, whereas you come down south, you're not going to get that because there's almost no union work down here. Now, if there's an argument for having a union or not having a union, but that's really irrelevant to the point. When I'm driving home is that is an issue, and it does come off the taxpayers' backs, and it is a better education. And to my fourth point, I really didn't understand what you were trying to say, but there is insurmountable evidence that anytime that you do a minimum wage, there is a loss. Now, how these metrics are gone through and then added and figured out what's the actual loss, that's really up for debate, because if you do like a structural vector autoregression with a casualty test or something like that, you'll see huge losses on the job market because you're taking into account uh, more variables. And if you do just like a strict ordinary least squares test on like the job market before and the job market after, you're not going to get that big of a move. And if anything, you might even get a positive move. But that's because you're not holding for enough variables. You're not holding for job growth. You're not holding for current expectations and climates. And that's really where the problem arises. But if you do thorough metrics, you will find that there is a distortion, and this does lead to uh, less people having jobs, and it's very forceful towards minorities, which is exactly who it's meant to help, and that's a big problem. And there's even historical references of South Africa using a minimum wage and unions of the North using minimum wages explicitly to stop minorities from getting jobs due to their lack of education or bad education. So when it comes to a well-intentioned policy, you have to ask yourself, what was the original intentions of this policy? And this was to keep minorities from jobs that people thought were predominantly for white people.
Go ahead. Okay. Well, kind of going back to the corporate welfare thing. I mean, yeah, and that in the sense that you speak about it, it is a little irrelevant. But this is my fear with this thing, is that say that someone works one of these low wage jobs for 40 hours a week, they're probably not only working 40 hours a week, but they're probably collecting food stamps and HEAP and all these other public benefits. So if they're not paid a wage that's high enough, it ends up being government subsidized. It kind of ends up being a handout to the corporation, which isn't the little guy. Um, as far as society setting standards, I think it actually is more objective here than you're painting it, because the standard would be what it takes to live. I mean, if you're making this 750 an hour, the you need $15 an hour here in Columbus, Ohio, and this is, we have a very low living cost. I'm always have sticker shock when I travel to larger cities. So it's only half of what you need to live anyway. Um, as far as the job training, I mean, we'd have to compare the numbers and all that sort of thing. And I really do agree with you though that an employer isn't going to value anything more than anything over the experience that someone has, because they don't know what you can bring to the table, as opposed to you just studied something. When my first question for any college would be, what kind of job placement do you have? What kind of internship will I get? That sort of thing. But the friends that I've had who are electricians, they have always done very well. I mean, I don't have anything to look at, but they've always done very well, and that's something that my understanding is that it's just a good thing to get into, because it's growing. But just because someone, they take a class on one of these some internet class, doesn't mean that they know how to go out and become an electrician. As far as the distortion of price control, because I know you went back to that. This is really my big thing with this, is that um, it's like I'm not arguing that it should be higher. This is the reason I'm arguing that it should be higher, because if it was $15 an hour or more than that, I kind of agree with you that that would put a burden on especially small businesses and employers and less jobs. But I think it's about a number though, more than just having the minimum wage altogether. Because like if it was a dollar, right? That who couldn't afford to pay? If it was less, who couldn't afford to pay that? And then as I was relating, it's only half of what the cost of living is anyway. And I really don't know of, the only jobs that I know of, at least because I look at job ads a lot that would pay so low, or are jobs that people wouldn't want, at fast food restaurants and all this sort of thing. Um, yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
Yeah, well, on that statement, yeah, I mean, there's only 3.3% of the population as of 2015 that make minimum wage. So, I mean, it's not really that big of a population, and of that, the largest majority is under 18. So there's that statement, which goes to the point about people under 18, and the largest proportion of that would not be on public benefits. They would not be subsidized by the taxpayers. They're subsidized by their parents. But to that point about public benefits and subsidized by taxpayers, now to that I agree. But it's such a small amount, and there's really nothing you can do about it outside of ending public benefits, which I would be a fan of. But at the end of the day, it's in nominal terms, it's not even registered in, like, comparatively to defense budget, to Social Security, to Medicare, to Medicaid. It's a paltry amount of money of those persons who are on who have a full time job at minimum wage, who are on government subsidies. That's just such a low number. It's not even worth talking about at this point. Especially when you compare it to the costs of the monitoring costs, of the cost for training programs to get people jobs per se, rather than on the job training. And we go back to that society standard of what it takes to live. Again, I really have to disagree, because that's not a societal standard. That may be a standard that you agree with. I don't agree with that. I do not believe that at any point in time that there is a standard of what it takes to live. That's your goal. That's not mine. It has absolutely nothing to do with me. I work hard and I make what I make, and if I don't make enough that I can't feed my family, it's not your fault. It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with society. It is absolutely upon me as an individual within an individualist country. So, no, I do not believe that that's a society standard. We may be moving to that as a societal standard, but the generation that's coming after, they're going to be a lot more conservative than this current generation between 19 and 36. So, again, you know, really what we're talking about at the end of the day is that minimum wage causes harm, more harm than it does good. Pizza, right? Pizza night. Sorry. Just so everybody knows, it's pizza night. Uh, so, I, again, we can take the consequentialist viewpoint and say it does more harm than it does good. I mean, especially when it comes to minorities. I want to drag that one out, because that's such a big point that everybody wants to point at. We need to raise the minimum wage so that minorities make more money, which I find offensive anyway. Because minorities make what minorities make. It has nothing to do with whether they're minorities or not. It's the individual. But secondly, if we look at the causality of it, it directly attacks minorities because of their lack of schooling, because of inner city schools are absolute garbage. Whereas typically the white flight of the suburbs, they're not going to have that problem. They're going to have smaller classrooms, better education. At the end of the day, they're gonna do better when they hit the market. Now, later on in life, that's completely up to that person's willpower, ingenuity, and IQ. Your turn.
Well, I've actually known quite a few people who we're getting an echo. So, okay, so I've actually known a few people who worked 40 or 60 hours a week and collected these benefits. And I know quite a few college students actually collect them. There's a lot of people who take advantage of them. And I think a lot of people, that, they don't want people to know that they use them, um, because they just because they feel humiliated about it or whatever. So a lot more people are on it. I've seen numbers that it's only growing, especially with the food stamps. And not I mean not that I really don't really disagree with you at all, though, that it's a very small amount of spending, which would be the reason that I wouldn't argue against it, because it's such a money that's spending at home and it's just a small amount of spending. What's the point of cutting that? I mean, if you're going to argue that you should just cut everything, I can understand that, but in a more general sense. But as far as that goes specifically, I, I don't see a reason to cut it. Um, it's going back to this. I think it really is objective, though. I mean, it goes back to what I said before that this minimum wage is only half of what the cost of living is anyway. So this person who makes this minimum wage, if it's only half of what they need to live, they're gonna have to make the other half somehow, and that means that they're probably they're not all of them are going to be willing to work a second job. They're gonna, a lot of them are gonna think, I already worked this job 40 hours a week. Why should I have to go and work this second job now just so I can buy food or whatever? I'll just go, get these food stamps, or I can get a subsidy for this, or whatever the case is. Um, uh, uh, yeah. Uh, so those would be my contentions with your points there. Um, so go ahead and pass it back.
Okay. Again, I understand what you're saying, but we have to really break down society, right? Society is such a terrible word. It's actually one of the few words that I cannot stand because it applies personhood and personality to a group of anonymous beings, which, I mean, again, let's take anonymous, for instance, right? Anonymous says we are not one, we are many, we have no feelings, we, as a group, we have all of this, and you have to apply that to society. Society does not make decisions at all. Um, Group efforts of people might, but society does not, because society is such a mixed bag of things. Like, it's hard to pin down what society would want, and it's not a single person. It has no single idea, um, and I really think we have to drive that home. And I mean that not just for this debate. I mean in general, we really have to get off the bandwagon of society, because society does not exist. The only society any person ever has is their very close family and their very close friends. That's the only society that you'll have, because that's where you're going to get most of your guidance for your uh, for what you do, because that's going to set you for your dominance hierarchy. That's going to set you for your emotional level. That's going to set you for your cognitive level. I mean, what someone does in California outside of, unless they're passing legislation that directly affects me, has nothing to do with me. Your feelings do not apply to my life at all. Society's feelings, if we want to use it in that manner, has no application to me at all. So I really want to drive home that society is really a misnomer. The only society we have is our family, very close family, very close friends. I mean very close family, typically maybe mother and father, depending on how old you are. Um, Sometimes brother and sister, but that's typically, again, based on age. You get to a certain age, your brothers and sisters have no opinion to your life, but your kids and your wife and maybe your best friends would have more pull on you on what you think and what you do. Um, Really, we admitted that there's not a whole lot of money that's getting poured into this system, and that's just, you're talking about subsidies in general for people. It's even smaller at the minimum wage rate of people who are on minimum wage. I mean, of the workforce is 3.3%. Of that, 16% of that 3.3% are in the service industry, where tips actually make up the loss. And then again, and the next largest, and of that, the largest paradigm is children under, children under the age of 18. So at the end of the day, we're talking about a percent of the overall economy that's taking in minimum wage and being subsidized by the government. It's so small. I think like two tanks, maybe, in comparison to our 5% of GDP budget for defense. So it's not even worth calculating most of the time, which is why you won't find any numbers on it, because it's just so small, it's so non-existent that no one No one even makes an argument towards it, except for, I guess you could say, extremely right-wing libertarians like Ron Paul, who would make the argument that it's too much money, that it disincentivizes work, or the conservative argument that we need to set up a hierarchical assessment for it. So as your wage goes up, you lose this amount of benefits until you're past the equilibrium and you can get off the benefits fully. But at the end of the day, those are the only two arguments that are really going to be used. And one's saying, yeah, sure, it's fine. We just need to make a hierarchy. And the other one's no, bad all the time. And both of them are quite useless when it comes to like labor markets. I also want to make another point real quick about labor relations and compared to work, right? So we typically talk about labor directly tied to corporations, companies, small businesses. We really don't ever talk about labor as a part of the labor market, how much the labor market's willing to take. There's definitely good bit of resources from the black market that we know of where people make less than the minimum wage and do just fine. In fact, on average, might make more than the person who brings home $10 an hour, which is $3 above federal minimum wage. You know, if you're making $5 an hour and you're working 10 to 12 hours a day, you know, and you're not paying taxes because it's under the table, you're probably coming out better in the end. So there's good reason. There is good reasons to believe that the market would set this to a better value, especially if we open the whole market up to it. And there would be less discriminations for these, where these jobs are being picked up by people who are in lower income quintiles. Could you imagine doing internships at a body shop, making $4 an hour, and then 3 years later you're working at the body shop and you're making $21 an hour? That goes back to that on the job training, because I did that. I made $5 an hour, worked 12 hours a day. 2 years into it, I was running the body shop. I was making $750 a week under the table, and it was amazing. I was making money hand over fist, and this was in 2007. So $750 a week was quite a bit of money at that time, based on inflation and things of that nature.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna get it's gonna be that echo bothering me. Okay, this is a bit anecdotal, but this has been my experience and one of the reasons that I feel this way. When I worked as a waiter for over 3 years, I earned tips as a waiter. About 6 months into my position as a waiter, the company decided to not only stop paying the host a wage, they decided that they were going to make tips and that the customers weren't going to tip them. I was. So that meant that I had to pay out of my tips that people gave me, not the company I worked for. I had to pay the host now. And also they said that they were going to not pay the bartender lower wage, not drop them from just being paid a wage, because they received more tips anyway. But now I had to tip them part of all my alcohol sales, and I had to really bump up my sales for alcohol too. and and the thing is, and this is and as a waiter, I had to pay 10% of all my sales, like the taxes that I paid that were taken out of my check. I earned $2 an hour. I never sometimes my checks were actually for negative money. The taxes that were taken out were based on 10% of what my sales were. So say that someone comes in and they decide, because this happens, people just don't tip. I've actually, I when I was a waiter, I even remember going out with people who everything was fine with the service and everything, and they just more than these people just don't they just don't tip. They just don't do it. So when if I get stiffed by someone, I not only do I have to pay a tax on that, I have to now pay the host and the bartender. So the companies are finding different ways to get around these wages, because for them it's all about profit. And I was selling, I was I just want the reason I wanted to be a waiter was because I knew I actually made twice in cash. So I only paid, so the benefit of this is I only had to pay 10% in taxes and I leave there with the cash, right? So I'm making more than the guy making the food. I'm actually making twice than what he is in tips, and I get to take it home that night, and I don't even have to pay as much in taxes. So of course there's a problem with government interference here, but there's all that but the burden was being put on me as the worker to maximize the company's profit. Uh, so that's kind of how I've kind of reached this, that because going back to your main point for me, like that's the reason that that I feel like we're debating that should there be a minimum wage, should that be abolished as opposed to it be higher, which is what, if you read any editorial on this, it's about if it should be higher or not. It's not so much your point, because for me it's a number. I think there is a number where you're absolutely correct that it would create all these problems. It would be a burden, but it's too low of a number. Those checks were for negative money. Because I really don't, totally disagree with you about this thing that the taxes are too high. I mean, there really isn't any. If you were to say that there isn't anything that would benefit these workers more than lowering the taxes, I agree with you 100%. Um, but there's a number where this happens, and I just don't think 750 is that number. So, and say that the number were lower, these people still have to pay their bills, right? So if we eliminate the minimum wage and they're getting paid the $2 an hour instead of $10 an hour, and there isn't another worker there to subsidize that, how are they going to pay their bills that month?
Right. No, I understand. I just want to throw this out here, and this is for everyone listening and who may not have ever read Adam Smith's A Wealth of Nations, or anything by Milton Friedman, who is a Smithonite in heart, or just about any other free market economist, which there are some that don't really fall into the stature, but really a true capitalist does not like businessmen. I do not like businessmen. Businessmen, funny story. So if you ever read the Communist Manifesto and if you ever read The Wealth of Nations, they're actually the polar opposite that say something very similar, right? The Communist Manifesto actually talks about how great businessmen are because Karl Marx had a huge influence on him by Engels, who was a business owner, right? And then you read The Wealth of Nations, which is an academic about free marketeering, right? Well, the Communist Manifesto talked about how great businessmen are. Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations did nothing but denigrate businessmen every chance he got. He called them vile. He called them nasty. He said at any point in time, a businessman will use whatever leverage he has to distort the market, to hurt the consumer, to make his profit go up, and to use the government as a hammer against competition. And all of that is 100% true. That's why keeping the government separate from business is a goal of the capitalists. It's not so businessmen make more money, it's so they can't use the government and the force that it produces against consumers, against the laborers. So that's a point I want to drive home. And I want to ask you a question with that business. This is just an off the cuff question. Did that company go out of business?
They're still in business.
Are they?
They're not doing. They're still in business. They're not doing very well right now. This is over 10 years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Their problems got bad maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
They are doing great. I actually went back there after I graduated and worked for a short time, but I just couldn't do it anymore.
Right.
I just couldn't job anymore. But they're doing great at that time. They were doing better than they were when I worked with them.
Well, yeah, and I want to make a statement about that because I'm glad you brought that up. 10 years ago, we had what's called we had what's called a business market, right? So businesses know everybody needs a job, so they can treat employees like crap. And you can go to a factory and find this, right? So if you work at a factory during a recession, they're going to treat you like crap. They're going to have their quota numbers so high, you're barely going to be able to pass. You're going to go in there, you're going to work 100%. If you're filling their production rate, you're out the door right there. Like, there's no argument about it. Now, you come to now where we've got pretty low unemployment rate, at least U3 level of like 4.8, 4.9%. That means jobs are out there. Everybody has a job. Everybody can go get a new job. I can quit a job today, go get another job tomorrow, making the same wage, if not more. Companies know this, so companies have to relax standards, and companies have to stop messing with the laborers, because the laborers are just going to up and leave. And this happens. It goes along with the business cycle. It goes up and down. Sometimes it's a business market, sometimes it's a labor market. It's all about how it happens. So that's something to talk about. And now with that company, it would definitely be of use for you as an employee there, to, if you're going to quit, and if you're having a problem, you know, do some collective bargaining. Maybe not unionized, but collective bargaining. Say, hey, you can't. We're not going to put up with this, and if you do this, we're all going to quit. And if you continuously do that, they're going to be forced to change their methods. Or you could go public now with social media. You're going to have less and less of these situations happening, because the more it happens, the more people are going to get on social media and complain about this business practices, and people are not going to eat there, and people are not going to go there, because people are typically, despite what most people think, are pretty humanitarian. And this company's going to flounder and go under. And we've already seen to some extent that they're not doing very good. And so, yeah, I'd like to drive that point home too. That really, and that goes back to what I was talking about when I was talking about labor and those things, is that in the market for labor, the labor gets to set what happens. It's not the employer; it's the employee. And if the employees are not willing to put up with the crap that the employer is doing, that company's not going to be there. One of the biggest problems small businesses have, and entrepreneurs, is not that they have bad ideas. It's not that they've chosen their market, because those guys, they go to school for 4, 6, 8 years to be entrepreneurs. They're just terrible at managing businesses. They're bad to their employees, and their employees don't want to put up with it. Or they're bad to their customers, and their customers don't want to put up with it. And that's something that again never gets brought up, because more people are worried about the company's profit level, the company's practices, when in reality it's, how do the employees feel? How are the employees taking this? And I'm sure if you did a good examination on Walmart employees, depending on where you're at, they're actually pretty happy, especially some of the older ones, which Walmart has a pretty significant stance on hiring older individuals. So there's those points I'm driving home.
I think it just kind of goes back to, is it a job that anyone would want? I mean, it's how would someone, if they're not earning a wage where they can even live, how are they going to create capital? And if an employee is if it's the labor side, um, the labor side has more power than the administrative one. What authority do they have to say that you have to pay me this wage, or it's unfair for you to, you have to pay me this, at least this wage, or that's unfair. Um, Especially because if these are, and the other thing I think, you get is like these jobs, like these restaurant jobs, and like say a security job or something like that. I mean, these aren't jobs that are difficult jobs. That anyone can do these jobs. So, and like say, the restaurant one definitely isn't, but there's some of these jobs where the tasks are easy. It's, you can bring someone in right away. That's easy to replace the person, and the company is probably going to, if the recruiter were to approach them about a raise, they would probably just remind them how expendable they are. And and I know there's cases where maybe that's true, that the employer is being unfair to the person. And but even in today's, by social media and this sort of thing, I think that person, they're, especially if they've been at this job for a while, what that could harm them in the future with trying to find another job. It's because what is when they talk to their supervisor or their HR manager, and they're probably not going to give them a very good recommendation, because they'll see any sort of questioning these decisions is a rebellion against so that would be my counters to your points there.
Okay.
We only have a few minutes left. I don't know if you want to go ahead and finish.
Well, I'm going to address those last statements, and I'm gonna give a real quick rundown of my points, just my points. I'm not going to go into it. Um, I just want to point out some people are just not meant to make much money. As sad as it is to say, some people just aren't. They don't have a high enough IQ. They'll, being at an IQ level of 85, you're bordering on some problems when it comes to cognition, and you're not outside of you're one standard deviation from the average, which is I think anywhere from 64% of the population. So it's not really it's not completely out of left field to think that someone's just not ever going to make much money, and it's just a part of life. And it sucks, but I don't know. I don't know what to say. This just bad, guys. It sucks for you. I'm sorry. The government's here to help. And you say you're not sure how that happens. Well, you've got unions and you've got individual bargaining, right? I can individually bargain for my wage. I've done that more than once. But a lot of that comes down to your personality traits. Are you agreeable or disagreeable? People who have higher levels of agreeable make less money because they ask for less wage. People who have high levels of disagreeableness, they make more money. Now they're not always employed at the same rate, but they make more money. And when it comes to questioning your company's business and status quo, and you're going to get a bad recommendation, whatever. If you're good enough, you're going to get a job anywhere else. So it's not really a big problem. And if you're coming up to a company like, hey, this practice is wrong, this practice is wrong, this practice is wrong, and they give you a bad recommendation, you can sit in you can sit in a meeting with another employer and be like, this is what happened, this is what they did wrong. So I'm going to run back over it. So minimum wage laws, costly taxpayer-funded monitoring and enforcement mechanisms that markets do not have. Second point is forced discrimination. Third is denies on-the-job training. And fourth is price controls are always distortionary. Thank you for the debate.
Okay.
My pleasure. Glad we had the opportunity to talk again before the tournament might get matched. Kind of going back to the bad job thing before I hit your main points to finish. Is I think it kind of varies by industry, and I'm saying this as someone who's in an industry where there's obviously way more people than there is jobs, and there's a lot of bias in my industry as well against me. So I think it kind of varies by the industry. I think you kind of have to factor in that there's other industries like say being an electrician where there's more than plenty of jobs, than I could in this one that I'm in where I'm just kind of lucky to have one. I just gotta go with the flow sometimes, and yeah, it sucks. So you hit on your four main points. Uh, the first one that it costs the state. We have corporate welfare. There's other things that cost the state. So it's really just a number. On the job training one, I think that's really a really good argument. But there's no way, I think, without statistics to come to a valid conclusion. And since it's a number, I think unless you're arguing for a higher one, you can't really talk about the price control because it's only half of what the living wage is. So those would be my main contentions. And I thank you for the debate, and wish you good luck in the tournament.
Hey, thank you so much. I don't know if I'll be in the tournament. I might. It's up in the air because I'm getting ready to start a job, and I'm getting ready to get a paper, hopefully, up. and out and published about convergence of monetary policy. I don't know if you see my debate with Nelson. So there's that, and I've got a macro course that I have to take that's considered like uber macro for undergrads. So I got a lot going on. I may or may not. I hope I can, and if I do, I hope I win.